Logistics has moved from the backroom to the boardroom. The demand for tighter control over inventory has heightened awareness of the critical role that logistics is playing in creating more responsive and more resilient supply chains. That logistics is a linchpin in top-functioning supply chains has been made painfully clear during the past 6 to 8 months, as even the best service providers were stymied by various pandemic-related impacts. A dramatic imbalance in global imports and exports, combined with labor shortages at key ports in Western nations, has driven ocean rates up by nearly 200% on key trade routes. The situation with air cargo is just as bad. I'm Jane Singer, and welcome to A Seat at the Table. Today I'm speaking with Eric Williams, Senior Vice President, Global Head of International Supply Chain at Kuehne Nagel. Eric will be giving us a closer look at the current situation in shipping and his outlook for when we might see a correction. He'll also share his insights on some of the new developments that are enabling logistics to provide brands, retailers, and exporters with better transparency, flexibility, and control over their global supply chains. Before we get started, if you're looking to develop knitwear collections that meet consumers' demands for better design and higher quality, then Spin Expo is the place to go. It's the primary exhibition for yarns and knitwear. Spin Expo provides well-edited forums featuring top-quality products that are filled with creativity. To learn more, go to spinexpo.com. That's spinexpo.com. You can also find a link in the show notes for this episode. Now let's sit down with Eric and find out what's happening with logistics.
Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to have you on A Seat at the Table. I think that right now everybody is keenly interested in what's happening in logistics. It seems to have moved from the back room to the boardroom. Before we get started with some of the new innovations, which of course are very important, I think we need to address the current situation, which is keeping a lot of supply chain execs awake at night. It seems that shipping is one part of the supply chain that still seems to be in crisis mode as we work our way through the pandemic. So perhaps you can share some insights into what's happening and when we might start to see some improvement in the situation.
Yep, thanks, Jane, and appreciate being invited to this Inside Fashion podcast. So excited to be here. Looking at the current situation, I think requires actually the context of 2020 and looking back at what actually happened. And I think it's almost that we haven't had a chance even to catch our breath as we've been learning with all these changes that have been happening. For us, if you go all the way back to where we saw the pandemic hitting China and up to Chinese New Year, where we saw a lot of our customers accelerating their supply chains, trying to get the products out before Chinese New Year, a lot of unknowns about how long the factory closure would be and trying to make sure they're getting that product out. This is, I think, where we started to see all these changes happening that are affecting the supply chains right now. We then, after that acceleration, when the pandemic started to hit the main markets within North America, within Europe, South America, we then saw this deceleration as the countries went into lockdown. And at that time, that's when we really started to see customers saying, how do we slow down our supply chains? And this is where we started to look at what's happening with a lot of those purchase orders that customers were placing. And what we saw, if I look back at the data at that time, we saw a very fast purchase order reduction over those months, from even starting in February, which is quite normal on a local basis, but then an absolute drop off as we hit April, May, June. But also what we saw, Jane, was a huge amount of cancellation of orders. Up to 65% of orders we saw being canceled. This is across multiple customers that we deal with, as well as a huge amount of modifications. So that will be in terms of timing, slowing it down, changing quantity levels. So we saw this happening, and that was the first sort of impact where we were, very concerned, of course, how big is this pandemic going to sort of impact the global supply chains and what was happening with consumer demand. But then we saw, as the lockdowns opened up again, that consumer demand started to come back. And we saw very much the consumer demand in the North American market, particularly being very strong through the omni-channel and people moving to buying online, that this sort of there was a sort of multiple forces happening at the same time. But what we then saw from our customer base was how do we accelerate our supply chains? How do we get our product into the country? So there was a number of multiple things happening there at the same time. And this is when we started to see the first nuances of the equipment situation that started to hamper supply chains, which really then became a big factor in the second half of the year. And what we're seeing now is not to go into the details of what's happening, because I'm sure everyone is very aware of what's happening now with equipment shortages, although that is improving, but is it improving in every location? Not yet, but there has been some improvements over the last weeks. But we're seeing a lot of port congestion issues as well. And that's exacerbated also by the pandemic and the shortage of labor. So we have a lot of vessels sitting outside a number of ports like Rotterdam and Long Beach being large ports. And that, of course, is also impacting upon supply chains. So there's multiple things happening that, I think is exacerbating the issue here. So going to your question, when we'll then see things opening up and changing and improving? Well, I think we're still a number of months away from that, although I think we will see pockets of improvement going within the supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's good to hear that at least there's some movement in the direction of improvement, because I know that so many people, particularly in Asia, are sitting there with goods that they either can't get out or the cost is so high that people don't want to take them, because particularly if they're doing price-sensitive products. So it's good to hear that we might be moving in a more positive direction.
Yeah, and we'll hope for that. However, I think what's a bit unprecedented this time is that it's on a global scale that's impacted. It's not just something that's very specific, as we saw a number of years ago, that we had the big West Coast issues in the US with congestion at the ports there, or where we have a flood in Indonesia, in Jakarta, which impacts upon the infrastructure there, the manufacturing and the outbound shipping processes. This is really happening globally. And, what we're also seeing, and of course, a big topic at the moment, of course, then the impact on the ocean freight prices as well, which are unprecedented levels that we've seen. So there's so many multiple things happening. But I think the discussions we're having with our customers is really to say the whole idea of just in time that we used to talk about and trying to create very lean supply chains. And then we saw about it as just in case last year. Let's just do those products in just in case. To now, it's more than that. This is that now we just need to make sure we have our products in the right place at the right time, which sounds simple. And that really is the challenge that we're having. So for us is really working closely with the customers to say, how do we move those products in, and fighting every day to physically move them. And I think this is a tough part of the market situation we're seeing.
Are people rerouting things? In other words, typically you might take one route, but then because of, like you said, these log jams and port congestions and so forth, are you recommending to them to reroute it, or is it just a matter of you just have to wait because that's the way it is at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we try and find solutions all the time, but I think what we saw last year, Jane, with the sort of the deceleration of the supply chains post Chinese New Year as we went into the lockdowns in the other markets, the destination markets, customers were coming and asking, okay, what are the physical levers to slow down their products? There's different examples of origin warehousing, so slowing it down there, of course, slowing down the production and delaying the production or delaying the pickup, to detention in transit, so working with the carriers to find solutions when the products were already stuffed into the containers, to also destinations. So there was a number of levers. We were working with around 10 core levers with our customers in terms of, depending on where the product was in their international supply chain, to slow it down. Then as the markets opened up, we then saw an acceleration. So going to your point, how can we get it faster? So of course we saw stress on the air freight, and that market was already stressed. So we saw that in terms of how do we bring it in and providing options on the air freight side, looking at the sea air, so combination of sea and air. We certainly saw for the European market, the rail over the top from China in particular into Europe was another area which was also utilized heavily for customers. So absolutely, the discussions were, how do we use those physical levers to, either slow down or speed up product to market?
Yeah, it is interesting that it changed so quickly. And I think that from what you're saying, particularly with regard to port congestion, even if you added sailings, it wouldn't really help.
No, absolutely. And we see this. We have one platform called Sea Explorer, where we can see on there how long the vessels have been standing outside the port, and it starts to tell a big story that even if more vessels come in, they can't be operated. And plus, with the stretch and the stress, on the labor issue, we also see it's taking longer time to turn those vessels around. So there's a bigger impact happening here, and that's when we hear about some of the blank sailings coming along now. It's maybe not, it's not bad because simply they cannot be operated because there's this whole congestion that we're seeing with all the vessels being pushed back. So we will continue to see some challenges even post Chinese New Year. How long? We don't have a crystal ball as Kuehne Nagel,
Right.
but certainly, we expect that we're still going to see challenges throughout the first half of the year. But I think the port congestion will be something that will be continue to be a challenge until the system is worked through.
So really, we have to primarily get through the pandemic or get that under control a little bit better.
Yeah, I think so. I think what it is somewhat of a wake-up call, because we have seen, as I mentioned, supply chain challenges over the years. It always seems to be, speaking to one of the customers I work with, that there's always something that happens each year that impacts their supply chain, their international supply chain. And I think what we've seen here is just something on a much broader level. And I think we need to look forward, and how do we plan that there will be something else that comes, and how do we ensure that we have that responsive supply chain to be able to deal with that, both some challenges, but also some of the opportunities that will come as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. There are things we will have learned from having gone through this that we can apply to whatever comes along next. I think that today, if we're looking beyond the pandemic, and there will at some point be beyond the pandemic, most brands look for speed as a top priority now, even above price. So if we're looking beyond the immediate situation, where do you see opportunities for importers, retailers, or brands to improve efficiency and gain speed? In other words, if they're planning for that time that's leapfrogging ahead of this current rough patch that we're in.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, right? I think because part of this need for speed is driven by that consumer behavior. We're seeing that shift in customer behavior from retail to online, and that's been something that means that we're looking for greater flexibility, or customers are looking for greater flexibility with their product ranges, their product launches that are not only impacted by the retail footprint and the stock tied up in stores. So I think we're going to see with a lot of the omni-channel retailers, the challenge that's going to have is about balancing the stock between stores and online, and making sure they have that in the right location. So I think we have already been seeing that, where we've seen certain stock being slowed down and certain stock being sped up within the supply chain, or prioritization over certain orders over other orders when it comes to finding the equipment and what to push through. So we are seeing some of that speed and actually slowing down as well, when retailers are talking to us and asking us to manage what's inbound, and with the restrictions that they're having, how to help prioritize the products coming in. Because what we also saw already last year, when the markets were opening up, was how do we then reroute some of the product to those markets where that demand was. So that demand was driving a lot of decisions. And of course, it's then trying to find the best solutions for those. Sometimes you're restricted and have to re-export out into those markets for those players who have multi-country operations. So we saw a lot of that happening. So I think very much down to that retail, that customer, in terms of what their setup and infrastructure is and what their marketplace is, in terms of what are going to be the right levers to help them to speed up or slow down. But certainly having greater transparency on the orders, having greater transparency on the inventory, I think will be key levers to help them in the future to make better decisions as they're meeting that consumer demand.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and certainly it's going to be one of the many things that people are going to have to look at when they're managing that supply chain going forward. Because like you said, there's all kinds of things that can come up that are unexpected. So being prepared is probably the best offense.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's working with your providers in a more collaborative approach. But also what we saw last year in particular was the customers who had, maybe not the word is experimented, but had used certain of the physical levers were much faster to react in terms of storing their product at origin, so putting it into warehousing rather than shipping it because they needed to slow it down, or the ones that accelerated by making priorities on certain product lines. The ones that had experimented and had worked and had used some of those physical levers were much faster to react than the ones who didn't. And then product was coming into country, and of course then they had a lot of issues with warehousing space. And where do you then put these containers? How do you strip them because you have no space for them? So that, of course, then comes with the cost impacts as well. And to me, that's one of the areas where we're trying to open up to say to customers, we need to test these things. We need to, so you can turn those levers on when you require them, to either to accelerate or decelerate your supply chain.
Part of being agile.
Yeah, but being agile. But I think to us, we call it responsive. It's being responsive, and this is really driving that paradigm shift, I believe, that we're going to see in the industry going forward. I think the players who take that on board are going to be the ones who are going to be more successful managing their international supply chains.
Yeah, being proactive, testing out possible ways to manage things before you're into the midst of a crisis.
Absolutely, because then you know what you can turn on, turn off, and have those type of dialogues with your suppliers, be that from your manufacturing suppliers or from your logistics suppliers.
I think that the best players, like you said, will have taken our experience from this pandemic and used it as an opportunity to improve and get better, as opposed to just having gotten through it and saying, okay, we're past and forget about the past. Yeah, it'll be an opportunity for people to have tested what they could do in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's managing that risk, but looking at where there's opportunity to improve things. And I think those are going to be the discussions we're going to see much more. It's going to be much more around the service component, not just about the price. I think service is going to become more important here. And having suppliers, be that from the manufacturing, be that from the logistics service providers, the direct carriers, having those options with them to manage service. And I think, to me, that's going to could be one of the new trends that we start seeing going forward. And that will come at different price points as well, which is inevitable.
Yes, you're right. Service is going to become critical. It's not going to be feasible for people to simply just look at price. One of the things that we've been hearing a lot of talk about, and I mean, people were talking about this before the pandemic, but certainly since the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about nearshoring production. From what you're seeing from a cargo point of view, are you seeing that, or is it more something that's talked about but not actually implemented, or at least not implemented that much just yet?
Yeah, I think we do hear, of course, a lot about nearshoring. It's definitely one of the buzzwords, and in times like these where you want to be able to react very quickly to the demand signals, of course, having nearshoring, of course, that will help you improve to do that. I don't think we're seeing as much of that as it's talked about. I think what we have seen is the diversification of sourcing. There's no doubt that we're seeing that diversification, particularly outside of China, setting up mills. I know that you've talked about that and have data around that in terms of Vietnam and other Southeast Asia countries had already started prior to the pandemic. So the diversification around that. So we have certainly seen that. And that's also reacting to a lot of the aspects that are happening in the market. And I think we're going to see more and more coming in other locations as well, which may be nearer shoring, but not near shoring. So I think this idea, of course, makes so much sense, but I'm not sure that the price points and the infrastructure is there right now to see that at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And that's certainly the big sticking point is really that most of the fabric is still being produced in Asia. Even if the garment production moves closer to the home market, you still have to get the fabric there. So from conversations I've had with other people within the garment manufacturing side of things, they say that's the big obstacle right now.
Yep, absolutely agree with that.
When you're looking at diversification of sourcing, and again, from a cargo volume point of view, right now, everything, for many years, there was a lot of consolidation in China and also to a great extent in Bangladesh. Are you seeing significant moves out of there? And where are you seeing significant moves to, so to speak?
Looking at the data we have, we don't see significant moves. It's more gradual, and it's very customer specific that we look at. But certainly, we are seeing more presence out of Vietnam. We talk about East Africa, where we're getting a lot more inquiries than previously in terms of what solutions we can put in place. So we are seeing that diversification gradually happening, but it seems to be very specific to the customer and also what business we're doing with those customers as well. But certainly we're seeing that gradual change away from China, although I think China will still be very important for many years to come.
In terms of Southeast Asia, do you see any countries that sort of have come up on the radar as being particularly important, or when I say important, where you're seeing an uptick in exports of apparel or textiles?
We're certainly seeing, I think the one sort of leading the group there from what we see is Vietnam, and that's certainly becoming more important. We're seeing certainly pre-pandemic as well, but a lot of discussions around Vietnam and what we can do there to support the customers with that infrastructure in terms of consolidating cargo from their various suppliers, and how do we meet the different markets with the different solutions from there. So I would say that's where we probably have the most noise in terms of customer discussion, but Bangladesh continues to remain to be very important as well.
Another big theme around sourcing and certainly around logistics is digitization. What are some of the new developments that we can expect to see that would be accessible? In other words, that would be practical for most importers to be able to implement?
I think there is more discussion. And I think it's also one of the trends we believe we'll see accelerating during 2021 and 2022. And that's for that greater transparency for order and inventory management in order to make better decisions. And we see that there's still a gap there. And this is an area where we're also focusing quite heavily on that area, because I think there's other trends that come into it, particularly sustainability is one of those that we see as a key trend. And how do we monitor the international part of our customer supply chain to support their sustainability initiatives, which are generally more on the domestic side, but how do we then combine those international piece in there? So that's something which we also see as another trend happening within 2021. And we're seeing some of those discussions, more of those discussions on sustainability and how can we support that through our digital solutions to help customers to understand what their footprint, their carbon footprint is on the international piece. So that's definitely a trend we'll see accelerating within this year.
Oh, that's interesting, because you're right. There certainly has been a lot of focus on the whole transportation side and its role in sustainability, whether it be ocean carriers or whether it even be the last mile for e-commerce.
Yeah, and I think it's also, Jane, it's driven by consumers as well, as they're also demanding for more sustainable products and solutions. They're looking at it much more than previously. So I think there is also a responsibility for retailers to listen to that and to start promoting their products by looking at either carbon zero or carbon neutral transport solutions for their products as well. And that's of course where we come into play to help customers with providing those type of solutions.
What are some of the solutions that you're able to provide that would support this move to greater sustainability?
I think first of all, it's the dialogue to then understand what is the strategy for the customer. What are they trying to accomplish and when? And do they have a strategy in place that covers the international piece? We can come up with solutions, but it has to fit within the overall priorities that our customers have. Some, of course, are more mature in this area, have progressed further, have put down targets, and then, of course, are looking at how we can support those targets. And some customers even measure us against our initiatives that we have, be that in terms of having carbon zero, CFS, bias consolidation warehouses, where we make them carbon zero. So these type of initiatives certainly becoming more interesting for a number of customers to talk about. And of course, also in the transportation, where can we provide options which have less carbon emissions? That's one area. Or can we then offset those emissions or even provide carbon zero options as well? But to me, it has to be driven from the customer, because it's about prioritization. And right now, yes, there's a lot of prioritization around all the daily challenges that we have within logistics and moving those containers, moving those products. But I think there's also a strategic aspect in terms of understanding what can the logistics community do to support those sustainability initiatives, environmental initiatives the customers have.
Yeah, I think that it's not as easy when on the one hand you're trying to just get the goods to the market on time, and on the other hand you're also trying to reach sustainability targets.
I agree. And it's fair enough that we sometimes get pushed back and say, Eric, we need to focus. Absolutely. And I fully support that and understand that. But at the same time, we do have these strategic initiatives that we need to support, and it's having those discussions at the right time with the sustainability groups, scheduling it, understanding and progressing. Not everything has stopped. Yes, there's some clear priorities, absolutely. But also there's certain initiatives that we need to continue to progress, be that on digitization, be that on sustainability, that are very important and require that investment of time in between to ensure that we can progress on those initiatives with customers as well.
Yeah, for sure. Kuehne Nagel has always been a very progressive company. What are some of the new services that either you've recently introduced or that you might be rolling out sometime either this year or early next year?
Yeah, absolutely. We like to roll out new initiatives, particularly on digital solutions. I just mentioned just a few months earlier about our Sea Explorer platform, which helps customers selecting different routes to market, and be that on transit time, reliability, CO2 emissions, so which ones are the most environmentally friendly. So giving decision-making tools. We've just upgraded that with providing more details around what's happening with the vessels, what's happening with the ports, the congestions, the issues around that. So this is continued development we'll do. So I think we'll continue. I can't talk about what's coming up in the next year, unfortunately, but I think what we're also seeing, Jane, is a sort of a pivot towards how do we create more strategic partnerships together. That is where we're, starting to see and customers starting to understand how do the likes of a Kuehne Nagel help us to unlock some of that value, some of the challenges we have, some of the opportunities that we would like to get to. I would say that could be one of the big developments, if you want to call it, happening this year. It's those different discussions that we're having now, and I think we'll continue to have over this year, which I think is probably the big game changer from what's happened with the pandemic.
So in other words, rather than customers just simply booking cargo with you, they would actually be working in partnership with you, where you would be able to advise them on different strategies that they could be using, and taking a bigger picture approach.
And then, of course, asking us to say, okay, how can you help with that? Be that on visibility solutions, be that at order line level or shipment or container level. What are the different views they require to support them to have that visibility within their business, providing options within our own platforms, or even to provide data to their own BI platforms. I think these are some of opening up those discussions. That's what we're going to be seeing more of this year. But I think those opening up those discussions and that whole sort of paradigm shift I mentioned before, I think will then open up, what are the solutions, Kuehne Nagel, do you have to support us on those? What are some of the new technologies where we want to become a pilot to that, to be part of that development with you? I think that's what we're going to be seeing this year, and we're already seeing it this year, but we're going to continue to see that throughout the year.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because I'm hearing that perspective from so many different leading brands, that they're realizing that it's important to be able to work more collaboratively with their different service providers, of course, primarily with garment factories and with mills, but certainly with service providers like yourselves, where if you can work more as a partner, you're able to plan and customize a little bit better.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. It's the combination, right, of that, the day-to-day work, the communication, the proactiveness, working together on the day-to-day to resolve some of those challenges we see today, and to work through those, making the best decisions we can together. But I think it's also about the planning going forward to say, okay, if we're going to continue to see disruptions, how we're going to plan better, how we're going to have stronger responsive supply chains in the future to ensure that we can react much faster? And how is it going to help us to, ensure that we have the right products in the right place as well, to also meet that changing consumer demand that we have been seeing this last year? So I think there's a shift in mindset that we're seeing, where everything was very much clockwork. And yes, we had exceptions and managed the exceptions, but not that massive physical impact that we've seen in the last year. So but I think it's that sort of shift as we have to now look in a very different way, because we need to use a lot more of those levers that we hadn't maybe used previously or intended to use previously.
Yeah, that's true. If you're looking at particularly ocean freight, would you say that the biggest development right now is the digital platforms? Or is there something else that's more important or more, I don't know, a bigger shift?
We have been seeing over the last years a shift to requests for how can we digitize processes from a lot of the manual processes today as customers, to what can you help us with, and what platforms can you bring that we haven't invested in or not been able to invest in, because some companies have not invested in that area. And what can you bring there to help us, and how can you link that to the physical operation as well, because that's still a very important part. The technology itself is great, but you also need that physical component, particularly when you're moving product around the world. So we are seeing more of those discussions happening, and we are seeing and believe, as well as we look forward, that more of those discussions will open up with customers, as they've also been challenged during this period. And we know the retail market has been very challenged in the last year. And so that will be, I think, an area where those discussions will open up. And no, not just with the sort of the medium and larger brands, but I think also with the smaller brands who have multiple suppliers and need better transparency and better collaborative platforms to help them, and to provide that transparency of their orders and their inventory from Asia, from Latin America, be where it is, but to manage those more effectively. I think that's going to be another area where we're going to see more discussions happening.
Yeah, I think it seems it sounds like that's going to be the way, because we're hearing so much about everybody wanting to digitize, and like you said, everybody wanting greater transparency and tighter control over inventory. So it'll be really interesting to see how it develops, and just to see how the entire supply chain is really becoming so much more technology driven.
Absolutely, it definitely is, and I'm seeing that acceleration happening as well. But it's also the integration of those platforms, right, with your upstream origin operations, your downstream demand, that push and pull, and then combining that with, okay, how can I work with not only my suppliers, but also my logistics service provider to orchestrate all of that together? Absolutely, we're definitely seeing those discussions accelerating right now.
Yeah, that seems to be the ultimate goal, would be, as you say, the integration across all those platforms. So right now, how far along are we in terms of, and I guess it depends by company, but in terms of the best-in-class companies, particularly in the sector that we're focusing on, which is apparel, footwear, textile, how far along are companies in achieving that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? And working closely with a number of those, one of the big companies in this apparel area and footwear area said, even though they felt going into that pandemic very prepared, with having tested a number of options, being very mature on their supply chain, which was also a core focus of their strategy as well. They having discussions, I guess in the summer of last year, also the feedback saying, although we had done a lot, prepared a lot, had a lot of contingencies, we could have done more. And it was quite an interesting discussion, because I said, yeah, but you were the first to move here, you were the first to move there. I said, yes, we were, but we still had challenges in ensuring we had the products in the right places. And we had to learn through that process, because we didn't know all the levers on how to do that, because we hadn't done that to that simulation, to that level, and to that high degree. So that was, I think, a very interesting one, that even some of the customers where we see that they have very mature, very strong international supply chains, they also felt they could do much more. And so it was some good discussions in the second half of the year to start looking at, okay, what could those areas be, and let's explore those together. So I think we can all continue learning and working together, but I think that's also part of that stronger collaboration and partnership together to work towards that, to say, okay, how can we improve this for next time so we have those levers?
Yeah, it's an important conversation. Just one more question, and that is that if you're looking at this entire integration of supply chain and being able to trace everything and have the visibility, does anything at the moment look like a particular blind spot that we're still trying to tackle or gain more visibility?
I think there's, I don't know, two things come to mind. They're sort of little bit different. I think one is on the uncertainty. That's still a blind spot, right? Particularly where we see congestion at port. So I think there's still some very apparent ones where we simply don't know how long the vessels are going to wait, how long it's going to take to operate, how long can we get those containers out of the terminal. I think that one is still going to be there for coming months. It's still going to be a challenge that we have to be, wary of and plan around. I think the second one, maybe in terms of visibility, is maybe the raw material part, where we haven't, I think there's still an area there that we can explore to say, what is the impact of raw materials and the availability of those raw materials? And I think that's probably one of the areas that we could also see more discussions around in the future, if that's impacting upon the manufacturing process. So I would say, top of my head, those are probably two, one very concurrent now, and then one which I think is something which will be an area where we'll start exploring with certain customers as we move into this year and next year.
Wow, I think there's a lot of opportunity for everybody to improve, and that's a good thing because everybody's looking to be able to raise the bar, to be more efficient, to be able to be closer to the market or the market demand. So it's really interesting, and it seems as though the pain that we've all felt through this pandemic may end up actually putting us in a better place once we get past it.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's been a wake-up call for a number of our customers. And I think that's good in many respects because it gets us to think forward on how we can do things better. And if there was three takeaways, Jane, I would say one really around working towards having a responsive supply chain. I know there's terminology out there about resilient, which I see as a little bit negative, or flexible. we use the word responsive because that's, yes, it's managing risk, sensing risk, but it's also sensing opportunity and the ability to pivot very quickly using those physical levers that are required either to accelerate or decelerate the supply chain and making better decisions. That, of course, will be also supported by what we talked about in the second, I'd say is the second point, is then the digitization. So that visibility on the orders, on the inventory, having the end-to-end flow management, I think is going to be a really big topic. So that, I think, is, to me, is the second one. And that digitization, I would say, linked to managing the physical operations, going to be crucial as I think a key takeaway. And then the last one I would say is this paradigm shift in the industry, moving away from this very combative relationship to a much more strategic relationship with manufacturers. And manufacturers will also be looking at retailers who supported them and order contracts, paid liabilities, or for cancelled orders and so forth, but also with the logistics service providers as well, in terms of providing the different solutions, the visibility, exception management, order management, I would say will be one of the areas, and moving less from a sort of beating up your suppliers. I think that gravity of service will now outweigh the gravity of price. And the stronger supply chain partner relationships will also drive those sustainability initiatives, so some of the more strategic initiatives, which will have mutual benefits, and I think will benefit the end consumers as well.
Very interesting and really an enlightening point of view. I thank you so much, Eric, for sharing your insights and your expertise, particularly now there's so much happening in the market that everybody's really sitting there and scratching their heads as to wondering what's going to be next and how they're going to survive another season. So thank you so much for shining a light on some of these issues for us.
Jane, absolute privilege to be invited. So I thank you very much indeed for having the opportunity to speak to you today.
If you enjoyed this episode of A Seat at the Table, join us again next week when I'll be sitting down with Marty Neumeyer, founder and CEO at Liquid Agency, whose visionary approach to brand development has influenced some of the world's top-performing brands, including Apple in its formative days. And make sure to visit Spin Expo. From trend information to technical innovation, Spin Expo is the primary exhibition for yarns and knitwear. The fair provides well-edited forums featuring high-quality products that are bursting with creativity. To learn more, go to spinexpo.com. That's spinexpo.com. You can also find a link in the show notes for this episode. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in the next episode.